The Bible warns us about cults. There's certainly no shortage of cults in the modern world. In fact, it seems like every day there's some new wild news story about a cult leader who's done basically everything you would expect a cult leader would do. In this video, what I'm going to do is go over some of the hallmarks of a cult, how it differs in certain ways from what we might call a mainstream religion. I'm going to set cults off against the Orthodox view, which is the perspective that I take, Orthodox Christianity. And I'm also going to discuss the rise of the occult and witchcraft. I see all of these things as connected, especially given the fact that we are moving past the 2008-2009 explosion phase of the new atheists. And now we're moving into the period of people looking for something to replace that void with in terms of materialism, consumerism. Right? These things don't really satisfy men. So what happens is people then look for something to replace the spot that traditional religions previously had. In the words of Charles Manson, in this void come the multitude of freaks, geeks, and weirdos. And pretty much every cult leader can, I would say, accurately be described as a complete freak, geek, creeper, weirdo. I can't think of any cult leader where there wasn't something bizarre, creepy, and shady going on. And we all kind of look back on people who became interested in some cult or got into some movement with amazement. We can't understand how they got lost in the smoke and mirrors. So what I'm going to do is go through about 10 points, and of course I have 2 books on not just films but also cults, Hollywood, and the relationship between Hollywood and certain cults, right? Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, parts 1 and 2, which you can get signed copies at my website, jaysanalysis.com. The second issue there, the second copy has just come out, part 2, and the first episode, first installment, of course, had over 100 5-star reviews in its year of release on Amazon, and then of course another 50 or 60 5 stars on other places like Goodreads. So if you're more academically inclined and you want to see more of the connections between Hollywood, be sure and grab a copy of my books, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. But let's go over some of the 10 basic principles that we seem to see in cults. And I've studied cults for about 20 years off and on. I read the first book on cults about 20 years ago, and it was a book on cults and New Age religions. And in that 20-year span, I would say I've delved into dozens of books just on the topic of cults themselves. So I think I have a good vantage point from which to look at the issue. A lot of years of studying comparative religion, other theological traditions, and comparing that as well to cults. So let's look at 10 basic principles. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with some of these same ideas, but we want to keep this in mind as we work our way through this mini documentary video when I move into discussing Wicca and witchcraft and the rise of very bizarre religious movements and the profusion of occultic movements in our day, spiritualism, and so forth. First principle of the cult is the guru. Everybody knows this one, right? The infallible guru. Don't question what I say. I am your pimp, and I will pimp smack you if you don't do as I say. Give me all your monies. Give me all your mammons. The infallible guru runs the cult with an iron fist. Whether he is somebody like Warren Jeffs and runs a Skittles rainbow colored harem of prairie muffins, or whether he's Osho with his shady backdoor surveillance rooms, the guru of the cult is essentially unquestionable. We think of somebody like Jim Jones, whose sway was so powerful that he was even able to convince hundreds of people to drink the Kool-Aid. We think of Heaven's Gate and Marshall Applewhite with his crazy bug eyes telling everybody to wear Nikes and commit suicide. For the UFO comet that was going to take them all to the promised land. So an obvious marker of the cult is the unquestioned leadership of the guru. He can never be challenged, can't be questioned, and essentially becomes a godlike figure. Now, whatever is seen in the life of the guru, be it a harem of sex slaves, be it Rolls Royce, or a giant golden palace, all of these things are explained as necessary for the maintenance of the lifestyle of the guru. So even though there's a clear incompatibility between the life of the guru and his teachings, this is explained as part of the mystery of the cult, right? In many ways, mystery religions bear a lot of similarities to modern day cults, because while reason might not completely be shunned, reason certainly takes a second-hand place to the mysteries, or it is actually completely shunned. Right? Reason has absolutely no place in the religion. That brings me to the second point, which is cults tend to be anti-logic. Cults don't teach you basic logic, ever. I've never heard of a cult that taught basic logic. Maybe if we counted Plato's cult, right? Socrates, Solon, the Pythagorean cult. Maybe that's the one exemption of the cult that teaches logic. But typically speaking, the normie experience in the cult is not to learn the laws of non-contradiction, the law of non-contradiction, law of identity, modus ponens, nor any of the formal and informal fallacies. In fact, if you can find me a cult leader who does instruct his students in basic logic and formal and informal fallacies, I'll mail you a free book. And that's not an incentive to start your own cult teaching people logic just so that you can get a free copy of my book. No, in fact, the downplay of reason is one of the key aspects to how a guru and a cult maintains control. Right? The cult leader certainly doesn't want his cult people utilizing logic and critical thinking skills, because then they might call him out. They might realize that his golden potty that he takes his god pee-pees on, and yes, the guru probably sits down to wee-wee to tinkle, that golden potty doesn't match up with his teachings of everybody in the group being poor and giving their mommy's life savings to the cult. Hence why critical thinking usually doesn't work out good for a cult. The third principle that I noticed in my 20 years of studying cults is another obvious one, is the harsh rules and unrealistic standards. It's all or nothing, baby. You give your, like I said, mommy's life savings, granny's, stock options or whatever, it all goes to the guru, or else you're banished. Right? You have a lack of faith. You're not truly believing, and if you would only do that, then all of your hopes and dreams will come true. Now, of course, critical thinking people realize that this is completely preposterous, but the guru, of course, feeds on very weak-minded, very hurt, damaged, broken people. this leads to my next obvious one. Everybody's probably familiar with this, but again, it bears repeating because, you know, we're going to see this as an instructive warning for the rest of the discussion. We've all heard of the techniques of the isolation and love bombing. And in certain ways, it's similar to the way police officers or interrogators utilize good cop, bad cop, right? So rather than it being a good cop and a bad cop, in this situation, we have the broken, lost soul who comes into the cult and finds structure, he finds a meaning, he finds a community, which he's been lacking, and a purpose. And so there's a period of love bombing, all the needs are met, and then there's a period when things turn shitty, when the cult turns mean, when the slightest infractions call forth caning, call forth isolation, call forth, you know, living in a tank, living in a hyperbaric chamber, or on and on and on. And typically speaking, the punishments of the cult leader never match the infraction. The infractions are typically minor, such as doubting the cult leader, not giving him everything, and then you've got this, you know, insane infraction where you're you know, scrubbing carrots for the next 20 years. So we have this radical all or nothing declaration most of the time, and there's really no grace or mercy periods. The only time there might be another grace or mercy period would be if the individual is perhaps wanting to leave the cult. Now, plenty of cults utilize a lot of different imagery, and this brings me to the next point, which is that cults typically might be called a new religion, but quite often they attach themselves to the symbols and images of old religions or established religions, classical religions. Now, the older classical religions, I'm not saying that they're true, but they have gained merely through historical existence some degree of pedigree. In fact, no, I only think one religion is true from my vantage point, but that's not to say that there's no distinction between all religions and cults. I mean, certainly all religions share some cultic aspects, right? If we define cultic as worship of some spirit or deity, then all religions are cultic in that sense. But not all religions are necessarily cults, because not all religions share all of these common characteristics of what we can identify as a cult. So there is some leeway, there is some wiggle room, some gray area here between when something is an established religion and when something is a cult. And ultimately, I would say that requires some position from which to adjudicate between truth and falsehood. So ultimately, you do need some kind of orthodoxy and some kind of philosophic and metaphysical certainty to try to parse out what is and isn't a cult. But for pragmatic purposes, we're going to just focus on the common markers of cults. And again, the new religion aspect is very common. You'll see that this new utopian sort of movement that pops up didn't exist 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago. Right? It's been here, founded by some dude, usually some pretty shady, skanky shithead, right? I mean, most of the time, the guru is a very shady character. And this is, of course, another thing that we have to remember, keep in mind, and consider. What is this guy's origin? What's his backstory? Do we know, right? Does he claim to be from some intelligence group? This is another key factor that will pop up in a lot of cults, is that they always have these shady backgrounds, and very frequently they themselves come out of another cult. Perhaps they learned the techniques of culting in their older cult, their previous cult, their ex-cult. Perhaps they learned psychological manipulation in some government agency, in some intelligence agency, right? In some military. You know, who knows? It could be different things, but it does tend to be a pattern that the guru not only makes up his new religion out of the old, but he has a shady background. Right? His religious background suggests something odd. And more often than not, when we dig into the origins of cults, not surprisingly, if you follow Jay's analysis, are led back to, typically speaking, some sort of intelligence agency, some sort of strange connection of that nature. So it's always a good idea to try to learn the backstory of the guru and the cult's origins. And most of the time, I would venture to say, probably 70 to 80% of the time, you will tend to find this kind of a background. That doesn't always mean that the cult is necessarily immediately controlled by some intelligence agency, or that all cults are directly controlled by an intelligence agency, but it's possible. It could be just a blackmail operation. Who knows? Another aspect that we want to touch on is the sexual aspect of the cult. Cults are always obsessed with sex, and it tends to be pretty extreme one way or the other. The pendulum is swung one or other way between total obsession and total polyamory and orgiastic abandon, or it's some bizarre ban on any kind of sexuality at all. And both of these methods are means of control. You can control people through an extreme asceticism, which enforces a kind of weird, unnatural chastity on people who didn't really want to go that route, but they're being told that to be saved they have to do this or something like that. Or an obsession with total free love, man. The guru just wants to get in your panties, man. It could go either way. But typically we do see, along with the sex obsession, the money obsession. Right? This is a really obvious one. Pretty much everybody knows that the cult wants your gold. I want to go where the gold at. Give me the gold. I want the gold. I'm going to uproot that tree. I'm going to find that gold, right? The leprechaun cult told us everything we needed to know about cults. So, yeah, everybody knows that they want your life savings, they want your Meemaw's life savings, and they want all the stock options, and give it all. A lot of times cults, too, are obsessed with the end. End-time speculation, right? The end of the world's coming next year, 5 years, 10 years, and when it doesn't come, the guru buys his Malibu property. This is a common one, of course, in the evangelical circles. Plenty of end-time con men that pop up over the years. Again, having studied and watched religion, and particularly the Christian religious sphere for the last 20 years, countless sectarian, schismatic groups spring up, and they definitively declare that it is the end times, only to be wrong within a few years, few months, few days, to then readjust their dogmatic prophecies to fit their new timetable. This is, of course, a basic bitch level con artist trick. And again, with that, we can once again attach the idea of the radical disparity between the guru's actual lifestyle and what he preaches, right? The guru might preach total sexual chastity and abstinence, and he's got a harem of 50 prairie muffins. The guru might tell you you can only sleep with your wife once a year, something bizarre like this, and meanwhile he's having an eyes wide shut party every night. The guru's got a Rolls Royce, but you gotta auction off that Honda Civic and give him, you know, the last $1,000 you have. The healing powers and proof of the guru's miracles, the mystical bond that he's going to put you in with the entities or the god or the godhood, godhead, whatever he's claiming he's going to do for you, tend to be emotional. Now, this is one that a lot of people miss when they analyze cults, but I've noticed in studying comparative religion and so forth that with a lot of people, and this ties into the second point about logic, is that, and I'm not trying to displace emotions, you know, in the Orthodox Church, the emotional has a place in worship. We should direct our emotion towards God, but it's at the service of the reasonable, rational aspect that's in man. So we don't let our emotions and our passions dominate the way that we approach God. And simultaneously, we don't let reason dominate the way that we approach God. So we're neither emotionally based nor rationally, scholastically obsessed. We want a harmony between these things. We want the heart and the mind working in common in what we call the nous, to know God and to love God. But now when it comes to the guru and the cult, there's no access between you and this spirit realm, this Godhead, this entity, whatever it is that they are proclaiming to channel, outside of the cult leader, right? You don't have any direct access to God. Now in Orthodoxy, we do have a bishopric and a hierarchy, but that doesn't, in our view, preclude or negate the possibility of the individual also having a relationship directly with God. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. They're not in dialectical tension. They work together in harmony. But anytime there's a cult, there's absolutely no access to the divine outside of you going through the chain of being, which is occupied at the top of the pyramid by the guru, of course. So the powers, again, that the guru tends to claim to have or attempts to have are essentially just emotional feelings, heightened states of emotion in terms of a crowd psychology, jumping around, barking like dogs, rolling on the floor, participating in some drug ayahuasca ceremony, listening to some monotonous drum beat or some nonsense like this, which causes eventually an altered state of consciousness, just perhaps through repetition, monotony. These are kind of typical cult techniques, of course. And the powers don't really tend to do anything for the most part. I'm not saying there can never be a manifestation of something perhaps demonic, but typically speaking, the powers are just emotional feelings, right? We think of charismatic so-called false worship. People go to these giant Benny Hinn ceremonies or whatever, and they raise their hands and there's loud screaming over the PA system. And Benny Hinn shoots you with a spirit machine gun. And people fall down and flop around, and usually this is because of a heightened state of emotion. And as we said, I think also we can mention the bizarre money practices, right? We talked about the guru wants all your money, but there's also typically going to be some shady dealings with the cult or group's money. Nobody can have access to this sacred bookkeeping material. Nobody has access to the sacred books, meaning, of course, the ledgers of the cult. You can probably have access to the cult's cult book, but not the ledger books. Those you can't have. So there's no transparency. Everything's shady and hidden because, of course, you are an outer nothing, right? An outer portico. Know nothing when it comes to the cult. You're not an enlightened being. Only the enlightened beings can keep up with the cult's ledger. And that's why I say that typically, again, there are shady connections. Research this person who runs the cult. What's his background? Does he come out of military intelligence? Does he come out of a previous cult? Right? And those shady connections can even, at times, be betrayed by the mere fact that the cult leader wears shades. All the time in weird ways. I wear my sunglasses at cults because I'm a cult leader, right? The shades give away the shady character. So those, I think, are a good outline. And if you've watched a bunch of cult documentaries and if you've read books on cults, you'll know that that's pretty standard. So next I want to talk about the rise of certain cults in our day. Wicca, witchcraft, spiritism, guruism, right? This is becoming prevalent, and not just prevalent through groups, but prevalent through pop culture. Pop culture is becoming one of the main vehicles for the explosion and rise of cults, and that's leading to people having spiritual delusions. The issue of pre-lust, I'll cover the issue of pre-lust here in a little bit, and the rise of possession and witchcraft. We want to turn now to the question of cults and witches. And I say that because now that the new atheists have done their job, now that they've been a sort of wrecking ball to ideologies and society as a whole, back in 2007, 8, 9, if you recall, the four horsemen, right, of the new atheist apocalypse or whatever, who were just really rehashing 17th century deistic arguments as if they had not been responded to adequately, which of course they have. But what they did was prepare a hole, a vacuum in the hearts of not just Western society, but now global society. The atheism that they promoted has essentially opened up a vacuum that is now being filled with witchcraft and the occult. We've seen the explosion of this in the last 2 or 3 years, and not just in America and the West, but also even in Southeast Asia, even in places like Russia. Witchcraft in the Philippines, as millennials fall under the spell, businesses are catching on. It's a hipster millennial thing now. If you're a hipster millennial, you've got to be into witchcraft. And this article goes on to discuss how a formerly Catholic dominant country like the Philippines is being inundated with the rise of the return, not just return to animism, but the rise of witches. It says numerous records indicate that in pre-colonial Philippines, the Filipinos worshipped Bathala and Tagalog, the supreme deity who created the universe. They believed in Engantos, the spirits of ancestors, and the communities were dominated by Babylons. Isn't that an interesting name? Babylons, right? Or the shamans. This is exploding everywhere in the pop culture, they say. And so I just wanted to point out that we've seen some good documentaries recently, some good videos. KJ over at Scariest Movie Ever has done some excellent videos on the rise of the Hollywood witches and witchcraft. And I just wanted to give a shout out to him. His video is really good. Check it out. And keep in mind that it's not just in America that we're seeing the rise of witchcraft, given the vacuum that's been created through the lack of Orthodox religion in the West anymore. After the wrecking ball has come through, now it's time to promote the esoteric and the dark side. And we see that not just in the West, but also, since America is the toxic culture driver now for the rest of the world, it spills over into the rest of the world. If you like this analysis, be sure to click subscribe and give me a thumbs up down below. Also, be sure to check out Jay's analysis and definitely click the bell down below to be sure you get the updates.